Malaysia and Singapore are two nations that aren't that different. Both countries share deep historical ties, were once part of the same federation, and have similar multicultural societies. But as many people know today, Malaysia's economy isn't really as rich as Singapore. This is true despite the fact that Malaysia has a higher population, more natural resources like oil and gas, and even a larger land size. And even when the two nations separated in 1965, both Malaysia and Singapore had similar economic output per capita, also known as GDP per capita. Here's a graph on the GDP per capita of both nations, data from our World in Data. Here you can see that in the very year of 1960, Malaysia had a GDP per capita of over $2,690, whilst Singapore had $2,765. The per capita of both nations wasn't really that far apart at the very start. But if you start to extend just 2 decades later, you get to see just how far Singapore would reach, whilst Malaysia wouldn't be anywhere near Singapore. Here in 1980, you see that Singapore's GDP per capita is now over $19,827, whilst Malaysia had only $7,405. That's a significant difference, considering 2 decades ago they had similar economic outputs per capita. But this isn't really what we want to talk about in today's video. The difference between the two economies isn't new. What we want to talk about, however, is whether Malaysia can actually become as rich as Singapore. This is the question we want in today's video, because in truth, Malaysia has everything that Singapore has. They are richer, as we just mentioned, in natural resources, in people, and in land, all of which Singapore lacks. So, can Malaysia become as rich as Singapore? If so, what do they need to change? To understand what needs to change, and if Malaysia can become as wealthy as Singapore, we must talk about the economic models that the two have, and the differences there are. Let's first talk about Singapore's economic model. Singapore's economic model is built on several interlocking pillars, and these include global trade and investment, high-value industries and financial services, and efficient governance and long-term planning. Each of these plays a key role shaping Singapore today. For instance, when we talk about Singapore's global trade and investment, we get to see how the nation has a strategic location along key shipping routes, which allowed it to become a major transshipment hub. Here's a graph on the total exports of goods and services of both countries. Here you can see a stark difference. Despite being a small country as compared to Malaysia, Singapore has so much more goods and service exports. This is partly because Singapore's role as a global trade hub gives it a unique advantage. On investments, Singapore also excels much more than Malaysia. Singapore's government under Lee Kuan Yew has cultivated an environment that is very attractive to foreign investors by maintaining low corporate tax rates, excellent infrastructure, and a transparent legal system. These factors have enabled Singapore to consistently rank highly in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. But one of the biggest feats will always be low corporate tax rates. Let's compare the two nations' corporate tax rates over the years. Here you can see that Singapore's corporate tax rate has always been lower than Malaysia. Even though it is true that Malaysia has been implementing various incentives to attract foreign investors. Yet, because of corporate tax rates, Singapore will always excel. Now, this is not to say that Malaysia should copy Singapore. No, that's not it. There's a reason why Singapore can afford to have lower corporate tax rates, whilst Malaysia cannot. And that's because Singapore has a highly efficient tax system with a strong revenue base from other sources. Unlike Malaysia, which relies heavily on natural resources and traditional industries, Singapore generates significant income through its financial sector, global trade, and high-value services. Now, secondly, where Singapore excels, whilst Malaysia lags, is actually no other than effective governance and long-term planning. But one can argue that Malaysia also possesses these qualities. Former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who served for decades, had implemented various long-term planning goals for Malaysia. For instance, one of their most ambitious goals, known as Look East, was one of Mahathir's signature policies, introduced in the 1980s to encourage Malaysia to learn from Japan and South Korea's economic models. The idea was to adopt their work ethic, industrial strategies, and technological advancements to boost Malaysia's own development. This policy led to industrial growth, infrastructure expansion, and closer economic ties with East Asia. But while it gave birth to certain industries, and even well-regarded firms like Proton and Perodua, it didn't really create world-class institutions that were necessary to bring Malaysia to become a high-income nation. There were problems such as inefficiencies, lack of competitiveness, and government intervention in key industries. For instance, Proton emerged as Malaysia's national pride. Yet, as many argue, there was actually a lack of global competition within Malaysia due to protectionist policies. What this basically meant was that Proton was shielded from foreign competition, allowing it to dominate the domestic market, but limiting its ability to improve and innovate. Unlike South Korea's Hyundai or Japan's Toyota, which had to compete fiercely in global markets, Proton enjoyed government subsidies, high import tariffs on foreign cars, and exclusive access to the local market. While this initially helped Proton grow, it also led to complacency, lower product quality, and reduced competitiveness on the world stage. Here's a graph on the gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP for both countries. This is an important indicator as it will help tell us just how much each country is investing in long-term assets, such as infrastructure, factories, machinery, and technology. Gross Fixed Capital Formation, GFCF, as a percentage of GDP, is a critical measure of a nation's commitment to economic growth and development. Here you can see that Singapore has always surpassed Malaysia from 1960 to 1990. This was even more evident during the 1970s, where Singapore saw stunning growth in its infrastructure, whilst Malaysia not so much. That is all because of this GCFC data, as it truly reflects how much Singapore was willing to invest in long-term infrastructures. Unfortunately, even until this very day, if we adjust it, we get to see that Malaysia's GCFC investments are still lagging behind when compared to Singapore. That goes to show that Malaysia has not been as aggressive as Singapore in reinventing its economy and investing in long-term growth drivers. Now, let's talk about Malaysia's economic model and what makes it different from Singapore. Malaysia is a resource-rich economy. The country's wealth was built on its natural resources, tin, rubber, and palm oil, historically. Later on, the country became a manufacturing-based economy. What Malaysia became successful at was attracting continuous foreign investments from multinational companies, especially in electronics and electrical goods. However, while one can argue that it has helped make Malaysia's economy better, others argue that it has limited Malaysia's ability to move up the value chain and develop homegrown, globally competitive industries. Malaysia was basically stuck at relying on foreign investments for their economy, most of which are low-cost manufacturing. Let's compare Malaysia and Singapore's foreign direct investments. Here's the graph for that matter, data from the World Bank. Here you can see that foreign direct investment, net inflows into Malaysia and Singapore were the same from the 1970s to the late 1980s. This is a given because Malaysia was indeed an attractive destination, especially for low-cost electronics manufacturing. But by the late 1990s and onwards, Singapore's FDI would surge. This is a reflection of how Singapore successfully transitioned into a high-value, innovation-driven economy, while Malaysia remained heavily dependent on low-cost manufacturing and resource exports. As global industries moved toward automation, digitalization, and high-tech services, Singapore attracted top-tier multinational corporations, financial institutions, and tech firms, boosting its foreign direct investment. Now that we have discussed several of both nations' economic models, let's talk about whether Malaysia can actually become as rich as Singapore. For Malaysia to succeed like Singapore, they don't really have to follow Singapore's economic models. There are just too many differences. Singapore became successful in trade because of its location. Its financial industry can be replicated by Malaysia, but as a city-state, Singapore has unique advantages that Malaysia cannot easily replicate. Singapore's compact size allows for centralized economic planning, efficient governance, and a business-friendly environment with minimal bureaucracy. Where Malaysia can excel, however, is arguably no other than to fix its governance. Malaysia still lags behind Singapore when it comes to ensuring corruption is low, and, of course, bureaucratic inefficiencies. If Malaysia can successfully implement reforms to improve governance, streamline bureaucracy, and reduce corruption, the business environment will become more attractive to high-value investors. Secondly, Malaysia must also upgrade its education system. It must be able to cater to these high-value investors. Manufacturing at the highest level requires a workforce that is highly skilled in automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and advanced engineering. If Malaysia wants to attract high-value investors and industries, it must ensure that its education system produces graduates with the necessary expertise to compete in a knowledge-driven economy. But let's be honest, even if Malaysia actually succeeds in all these areas, the inherent differences in economic scale, institutional frameworks, and historical trajectories mean that its per capita income may never reach the level achieved by Singapore. In other words, while Malaysia may achieve substantial improvements in living standards and economic performance, it is likely that the gap will narrow rather than disappear entirely. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.